Hi everyone, I'm Alice.
And I'm Kathy.
And this is
Waterfront Wednesdays,
brought to you by
Boston Harbor Now.
Today, we are joined by Kathy Abbott, the president and CEO of Boston Harbor Now.
And I finally get to be on Waterfront Wednesday.
And we are thrilled to have Kathy here for a conversation about something that you are really passionate about. It comes from decades of working on it.
Let's not push the decade. Yes, it's all about parks, investment in parks, and the funding of parks.
Exactly. Today we're going to talk about the need for public and private investment in parks and public open spaces in general, and in the harbor, and particularly the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park.
Yes, and we think of Boston Harbor as the region's largest public open space. We think of it much like our libraries as some of our really important last democratic spaces. There's 7,000 acres of municipal, state, and federally owned parkland around the harbor, and 2,000 acres on the Harbor Islands alone.
But given that much of that parkland was used for totally non-park use things before 1970, particularly military uses, it's taken decades of investment to get the parks where they are today. And more investment is needed to protect the islands from the impacts of climate change and to continue to improve the visitor experience.
16 of those islands were designated as a state park in 1970. I was lucky enough to be a ranger living on Gallops Island in the 70s when the harbor was still really dirty and that most of the improvements that we see out there today were just a gleam in our eye. It began to change again in 1996 when the Boston Harbor Island National Park area was created thanks to Congressman Gary Stubbs.
And tell me a little bit what that legislation did.
It was really significant in that it added 18 islands and peninsulas to the original 16, so we now have a park of 34 islands and peninsulas. It created a managing partnership of all of the existing owners and managers, and most importantly, it created a 3-to-1 local to federal match so that we were suddenly going to be increasing the amount of money we were spending out there.
So what happened now that federal money was available?
It made a huge difference. If you look back now, you can see in the first 20 years of the park, so from 1996 to 2016, we spent $235 million on the Harbor Islands, which really outshone what had been spent previous to that. Local government and state government spent about $97 million. The nonprofit partners, the private side, spent $96 million, and then the federal government brought $42 million to the table.
You alluded to the nonprofits. One of those was the Boston Harbor Island Alliance.
Yes, the Boston Harbor Island Alliance was the first nonprofit ever legislated by Congress into the creation of a national park, specifically to bring private sector resources not only into the creation of the park, but into its ongoing management and operation. So it was a new model, one of the first of its kind at the time. And so we were in the business not only of raising private money, but also of working with the partners who owned the islands to come up with revenue generating ideas, and we could then be the vehicle for investing those revenues back into the islands.
And so that's the model Boston Harbor Now runs on today. We do that fundraising, and we also manage a whole sorts of contracts. We've got the ferries, we've got concessions, we've got mooring balls, the visitor center on the Greenway, and more.
And we continue to work in really close partnership with the National Park Service, with DCR, with the City of Boston, and all the other owners and managers of the Harbor Islands.
Let's pivot for a moment and talk a little bit about public funding for the parks. There was a move in the mid-2000s to address and close this funding gap here in Massachusetts for parks statewide.
Yes, it was the Conservation and Recreation Campaign, also called Common Sense for the Commonwealth. It was run out of the Trust for Public Land, and the goal of it was to get the folks who were running for governor to agree to get the state park budget back up to over $100 million. Deval Patrick committed to that goal, was elected governor, and brought the budget back up to over $100 million. Unfortunately, it wasn't soon after that we experienced that big recession in 2008, 2009. But unlike states like California and New York, where they were having to close state parks, we were not suffering the same impacts.
But the Harbor Islands parks in particular, and then kind of parks in general, they're not just getting funding from the official state parks budget. They're developing with all sorts of different kinds of funds.
Yeah, in the last decade or so, an awful lot of park funding, public park funding, has come through major infrastructure projects. Two great examples on the Harbor Islands. One goes back to the creation of Deer Island and the wastewater treatment plant, and the incredible, beautiful parkland that was created on Deer Island, and the wonderful perimeter walk that today is attracting 60 or 70,000 people a year to get out into the Harbor Islands Park. The other is Spectacle Island.
Spectacle Island spent the 20th century as the home to a horse rendering plant and then became a city dump.
We did a master plan for the State Park Islands in the mid-1980s, and it was suggested that if the Big Dig was ever built, we would use fill from what we then called the Third Harbor Tunnel, today it's the Ted Williams Tunnel, to cap that island and to redevelop it into a beautiful parkland.
So, what was once an island that sparkled with broken glass on the surface and then occasionally erupted into flame where there was natural gas leaking from the...
It was really fun to go treasure hunting on that island.
Okay, we're not endorsing that. They took that trashiness and they covered it with 3.7 million cubic feet of dirt from digging the tunnel. They capped that, they landscaped it, and there's a gorgeous park on top.
It was a really, really big vision at the time, and it generated really significant investment, and it transformed a place that none of us could ever have imagined visiting into what is now the second most heavily visited island in the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park area. It has the only lifeguarded beach. There are 5 miles of trail. There's a huge pier and marina and the mooring balls that you mentioned. And probably most significant, it's the highest point in the park with incredibly beautiful panoramic views of downtown Boston and all the way out and around to all of the Harbor Islands.
Yeah.
Stunning.
When most people think about the Central Artery Project building parks, they think about the Rose Kennedy Greenway or maybe Paul Revere Park, but it also built Spectacle Island.
And it wasn't the only place out there that we had a big vision that generated big investment.
Back in 2000, there was a plan for Pettix Island. It was creating a roadmap for how investments could be made in the island that would shape it and make it feel like it does when you visit it in 2019.
And over the past 2 decades, in following that plan, we've invested $5 million in bringing utilities from the town of Hull over to Pettix Island, drilled down underneath Hull Gut. We've also invested another $10 million in cleaning up historic Fort Andrews, which is a beautiful turn-of-the-century fort. It had 28 buildings. Unfortunately, a lot of them had fallen into serious disrepair and were quite unsafe. We were able to save 15 and clean up the asbestos and the other hazardous materials in unsafe buildings and create a really beautiful campus that really welcomes the public today.
Yeah, and I think if you're a member of the public, you might not experience all of that comprehensively, but what you might experience is a visit to what was the guardhouse that's now a really lovely welcome center. You might visit the chapel. You might appreciate that you're flushing the toilet or turning on an overhead ceiling fan in your yurt. Just these tiny moments that are all part of this larger investment.
We've accomplished a lot, and the success of that plan really is to bring investment to the park that was prompted by the Pettix Island planning process, and it prompted the creation of the Pettix Island planning process that we've undertaken right now with the support of the National Park Service and Department of Conservation and Recreation.
And the ultimate outcome of that plan is going to be to find productive ways to use the remaining abandoned military buildings on the island and to develop a roadmap for the next phase of investment in the park.
And there continue to be ongoing investments around the harbor as well. You mentioned the moorings earlier. That's one that we just started this summer.
And there's plans to improve a lot of the docks, particularly to improve better ferry access and water transportation.
And we'll continue to work with the partners and plan other islands as we go, and other parks around the harbor.
Yeah, with public and private investments and a model that allows the visitor experience to continue to iteratively improve over time, people might not see everything changing, more like a gradual transformation, but there's been a real change from having dumps and former military bases into having a welcoming world-class park system.
As somebody who's had the privilege of sort of living this evolution, which doesn't seem slow at all, it really is possible, and we hope to keep creating these really big visions and leveraging this really big investment, public and private, into our parks on the islands and around the coastline to continue to transform our harbor. Yeah. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Kathy Abbott.
And I'm Alice Brown.
You can follow me on Twitter at kabbott at BHN.
And you can follow me at Fairy.
If you like this video, please share it with your friends and your family and subscribe to this YouTube channel.
You can give us a like or you can leave a comment below.
We'll see you on the harbor.